Amazon employees in the US have made repeated efforts to unionize, but none has been successful to date. The e-commerce giant employs almost 1.1 million workers worldwide, but few are represented by unions. At America, we wanted to understand what's going on with workers' rights at Amazon, especially in light of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church that has long upheld the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Good day and welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Ricardo da Silva, Associate Editor at America Media. On Behind the Story today, we welcome Christine Ferrer-Hinze and John Miller. Christine is a professor of theological and social ethics, the chair of the theology department at Fordham, the Jesuit University in New York, and the president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America. John Miller is a Pittsburgh-based writer, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. Between 2004 and 2016, he was a staff reporter and foreign correspondent for The Wall Street Journal. And since 2018, his writing and reviews have appeared in America. His most recent article brings us to this conversation. The fight to unionize Amazon is the most important labor story of this century. Christine, John, welcome to Behind the Story.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you.
Before we cut back to our conversation with Christine and John, I want to ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just go ahead and click that red subscribe button now. Also, consider subscribing to America at americamagazine.org/subscribe. It's the best way to support us. Now, back to our conversation with Christine and John. John, if I may start with you, what's going on at Amazon and why now have workers come forward?
So it's a reckoning with a bigger problem in society, which is the way that we've structured capitalism now in this country after a half century of globalization, of automation. We have this massive workforce of service workers who make often under $15 an hour, who often don't have health care. And this is now a huge part of the workforce. And they don't have the salaries, the benefits, the dignity that workers had a generation ago. And the Amazon union fight is kind of a proxy for this bigger question. In this case, it happens to be a very big warehouse in Alabama. So the RWDSU union went there because it was such an important node in their structure. And winning a union fight there would have this wider symbolic effect they were looking for. Now, working at Amazon is not quite as bad as some of the other warehouse work and some of the contract workers that they also employ. I was in Columbus, Ohio recently doing some research, and I looked in the job offered ads in Ohio, and there was hundreds of these jobs, $12, $13 an hour, stacking, piling, warehousing, all this structure that we don't see that gets you that, the book or the computer or the package of pasta that you need delivered to your doorstep. There's a whole infrastructure behind the scenes, and that's millions of workers, and they're not unionized, and they don't make enough money to participate fully in society. Life in America has become very expensive, and on $13 an hour, you can't participate fully. And so that's what this fight is about. And Amazon, like a lot of companies, and we'll get into this later in the program, but they don't want the union there. It increased costs. It makes it harder to lay off people. And their business model is very much based on this flexibility of you need, I think they hired 500,000 workers during the pandemic as we were all stuck at home needing stuff delivered to us. So they want that flexibility as part of their business model. So it's not, their starting pay is $15 an hour. So they don't pay quite as poorly as some other places, but it's a very difficult work environment where they track your bathroom breaks, where they follow you all day, where you're rated on your efficiency, where an extra step could cost you a promotion, and it's objectively not a very human and dignified place of work, and that's what the union is fighting for.
John, I was wondering what's it like for workers at Amazon. So I'm just going to read something to you. Jennifer Bates, who's an employee at Bessemer, Alabama, Here's what she says. Working at Amazon warehouses is no easy thing. The shifts are long, the pace is super fast, you're constantly being watched and monitored. They seem to think you are another machine. My workday feels like a 9-hour intense workout every day, Bates said. We are not robots. I mean, is that what you're seeing there? There's a kind of robotic effort to get people to work?
I mean, work in a factory has never been easy, and the supply chain has always depended on people who do this kind of monotonous rote work. The question is it safe? Is it properly compensated? And does it treat people like human beings? Because if you are monitoring somebody and tracking their every step and docking their pay for an extra bathroom break, that's not a very human way of engaging with somebody. So there's a balance there between the work, which has to be inevitably difficult, and somebody has to do difficult tasks in society, but they do deserve protections. And unlike in Europe, where there are very strict labor laws, the United States often that balance tilts towards the employer, towards the corporation. And so in America especially, unions are often have been required to push that needle back towards care for the worker. So objectively, it's a hard job. I think nobody's saying that these jobs should. Nobody's saying that Amazon should entirely employ robots to do all the sorting. Human labor is required. But she's not alone in saying that. And a lot of people, I think, are coming forward and sharing more openly what this work environment inside of Amazon is like. And that's obviously very welcome. I think as a journalist, as a church, transparency is always essential to hold up to the light what's happening, and to, again, tilt that needle a little back towards respect for the worker.
Daryl Richardson, he's one of the first workers that's come into this unionization effort. And he told the Wall Street Journal this. He said, I got a monitor in front of me to let me know the items to pull from on that particular pod. I pull the items from that particular pod, put it in a tote, push them to the conveyor line where items can be packed. The same procedure over and over again, 10, 11 hours a day, only 2 breaks, he added. I probably pick between 14 to 1,600 pods. They want you to pick 315 plus an hour. By the end of each shift, he said, I walk out the door, I feel free. When I'm home, I don't want to eat. I just want to get something to drink and lay down. Sometimes I don't even eat. That's how tired I am. I'm exhausted.
And by the way, a book I recommend, which is out now, is called One-Click Fulfillment by Alex McGillis, a ProPublica reporter. And he chronicles this kind of work over and over again. And he talks to steel workers who say this is a more regulated environment than anything they had worked in the steel mill. So people had made the transition from industrial work to working at Amazon. And a steel worker can make over $100,000 a year with overtime pay. So this kind of backbreaking work has been compensated well in America, partly through the efforts of unions over time. But that's a common testimony, what you just read.
I mean, and Daryl Richardson is a black man. 71% of workers at the plant in Bessemer are black. This is also, at least the union is saying, and employees are saying, a civil rights issue. What do you see there in terms of the racial divide and work in the U.S.?
I think that's a really valid point. If you think about like the classic 1950s union worker, it's often a white man, and it's a white man providing for his family in a very traditional family structure. This new generation of workers trying to unionize, and you see it in healthcare, for example, where a lot of the nurses are women of color. And they've not been able to get this sort of strong foothold as a union in society, and also in our politics, where unions are not the political force they were in the 1950s. And so I think he's right. This is a civil rights issue. And if this unionization can happen, it creates a more viable political force for a lot of marginalized people, many of whom are people of color, in these millions of service workers working in warehouses, but also in fast food joints and other kinds of service work all around the country.
So, there are 6,000 workers that are, or almost 6,000 workers eligible to join this union. But there are also roughly 700 or so contract workers at this plant, many of whom, reports tell us, were formerly incarcerated women and men. And so they are beholden to Amazon as well and can't join this union. We read in some reports that they have been asked to wear badges saying no to unions as part of their uniform, as it were, on shift, as part of Amazon's efforts against unionization.
Yeah, so companies have a wide variety of strategies and practices when workers try to unionize. For example, what they often do is they'll fire the low-level managers who are kind of the face of the company and the source of aggravation for many workers. So in a way of telling the workers, we're listening to you, look at these guys you didn't like, we'll get rid of them and be nicer to you. They've hired managers who are often young, charismatic people of color who can kind of say, hey, we're on the same side here, you're black, I'm black, Amazon's treating us well, you don't need to join this union. They started a website called Do It Without Dues, and basically paint this picture of the union as this oppressive force that's going to make everything a lot more difficult for them. And it should be said that starting a union is only the first step. Once you have the union in place, then you collectively bargain, and there are all these rules. But the company will always fight that. And it's only when workers have real leverage, which again, with contractors, it's possible Amazon could just use more contractors, and you sort of kick the can down the road in that way. So it is symbolic in many ways, in that it doesn't get rid of all the problems of upholding the dignity of work, but it creates a political block and a political force and puts a little more pressure on the company. But the company is always going to fight it. And as you point out, they have a lot of tried and true methods. They hire consultants to do PR campaigns. Those little buttons you mentioned, say no to unions, and basically just painting the union as this destructive force that's going to muck up everybody's life. And they point out their starting wage is $15 an hour. They offer healthcare and benefits. At the warehouse, it's not the worst place in terms of compensation, but I think it's a measure of how low our standards have fallen that we think, oh, $15 an hour, that's not so bad. What are they complaining about? And the truth is that's like, almost, I think, $30,000 a year, which in most parts of America is not enough to have a good life.
Christine, I've been keeping you waiting, and I'm very sorry for that. But we just wanted to set the stage. And this is going to sound inelegant, perhaps even provocative, but what does the Catholic Church say about unions?
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate the way in which John has set up and described the scenario, which is a very specific, particular, contemporary example of a long-standing set of social and cultural and even religious issues that we find in the modern industrialized society around who has power, who is vulnerable, how do we protect the vulnerable, which is something most religious traditions care about, including the Catholic tradition. As you well know, since 1891, the Roman Catholic Institutional Church, via papal and episcopal documents, has spoken out about the need for protection and for solidarity with those who are vulnerable in our modern economic setting. Back then, it was, as John mentioned, mostly factory workers, people doing what we would say are working class jobs, and at that time with very little or no protection from the government or from laws against these highly powerful companies who were able to really determine their livelihood, their fate, their ability to even survive. And so it wasn't the Catholic Church that invented the union movement. However, beginning with Leo XIII, and then in the United States with people like Monsignor John A. Ryan, who in 1906 wrote a book called The Living Wage, there has been strong support not only for the rights of workers, as John said, and the dignity of work, but also for collective action to defend workers so that workers can be empowered and have a site of power to to balance off, to push against the power of what we see in something today like Amazon. So I was struck by, for example, we have a Catholic president right now who's saying, who's speaking positively about this organization of unions and so forth out of his own Catholic background as much as anything else. And his bottom line, though, is, and this was quoted in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, Biden says, it's the choice of the individual worker whether to be in a union, full stop. That's the American view. It's the individual's choice. And then in the very next line, this is the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal, they write, the free choice of American workers led to a 29% drop in non-government union membership from 2000 to 2019. Again, it's all about, from this point of view, the free choice of workers. A Catholic view, echoing many cultural views in Europe from which it comes, does not think in terms only of the individual. It thinks in terms of the common good and the fact that we're interrelated within this situation, right? And so even its view of unions from the very beginning is different from the way today people will critically look at unions. They're just self-interested, they're out for themselves. Once you're in a union, everybody gets lazy, all these kinds of critiques that you see out there. The big labor is going to take your money and not help you and so forth. The Catholic point of view is that a union should be a way of empowering this sector, workers, to be able to be a full participant in the enterprise of the company and the success of the company. And this is, again, just to quote something else that was commented on in Germany and other European nations. This commenter at the New York Times writes, unions are integral to the functioning of all the major companies. Labor and management work together to improve the lot of workers while enhancing the profitability and competitiveness of the company. This is a good way of talking about the way Catholic teaching has spoken about unions. It should be collaborative. Yes, it can be conflictual, but notice what I'm talking about here is a different ethos, a different way of seeing how this all works together in a political economy. And that, I think, is one of the biggest rubs, and John alluded to this, in the United States and the whole story of the union movement, especially today when our capitalist, neoliberal, kind of individualist ethos has been so accentuated in a, ironically, very interconnected global economy, which Amazon represents.
And unnecessarily utilitarian, perhaps. Just reading one of the spokespersons at Amazon, and I'm struck how this is almost identical, the reply that everybody gets, and every reporter seems to get exactly the same response. Amazon already offers what union leaders are requesting for employees: industry-leading pay, comprehensive benefits, and opportunities for career growth. Right? I mean, it's all about what I can get. It seems to me that the Catholic view has a different understanding of what it is to work and the human person in light of that.
Yes, you're correct. What you just described is an appeal to self-interest, right? You, worker, do not need to connect with your fellow worker because you will get what you individually want from the company. Therefore, do not connect with your fellow worker. And as you just said, that is a way of looking at what can I gain? What's my personal gain? From the point of view of Catholic thought, and Pope Francis has really brought this forward with his writing on ecology and on social justice. We are interconnected, right? I am interconnected as a worker to my fellow workers. I'm also interconnected to management. I'm interconnected as a human being. Work, from this point of view, is the activity by which human beings make their livelihood in community with other human beings. And so it's always a social activity, going all the way back to the family. The family is not an individual interest operation in its working, nor is a local community, nor is a company, and so forth. It cannot even survive if everyone's only working on individual interest. Adam Smith knew this too. For all his stereotypical, image that he has, he recognized that an economy works well when people are cooperating. There's far more cooperation than there is competition in any successful corporation. The lens that quote reflects is very much indicative of a U.S. Capitalist, individualist way of looking at things, that to which it is appealing and to which we in our culture are attracted. And because we are taught to think as individualists, we are taught to think of our individual self-interest. So if you want to say you have about 20% of this country identifies as Roman Catholic, should that make a difference in the way we are seeing the world? I would argue absolutely. But the question is, how are Catholics in the United States formed, taught, encouraged, informed about the fact that their very own tradition sees the world in a different way than that quote depicts? It's a very challenging thing to be taught to think or told you need to think beyond your own self-interest when in our economic life we've been taught that is the arena in which you do only think that way, right? I can be kind in my community, but when I go out to the work world, it's about me. That is, as you said earlier, that is not how the Catholic view looks at it. You're involving yourself in a cooperative activity for the livelihood of everybody involved, as well as the profit and all that, but it's never just about me.
John, how do you read this from what you're seeing at Amazon and self-interest or community?
I think it's essential when talking about community to look at the context of the history of these kinds of places. So Bessemer is near Birmingham, which until recently had a massive steel industry. They called it the Pittsburgh of the South. There's a huge statue. I've been to Birmingham. There's a huge statue of the god Vulcan, the god of the fire. And these are places that had community in very integrated, tight ways for generations, where you could work at the mill, your dad would work at the mill, and in a generation that got wiped out. And so I think in this union fight, there's an effort to rebuild some of that community where you would have a relationship with your coworkers that's not just dog eat dog and not just competition, that you're working together and you're trying to strive together to have a common good for everybody. And it's a great tragedy in places like this that's not spoken often enough, that there's this real grief that companies have really not just outsourced, but there's a great book by Brian Alexander called Glass House about a town in Ohio that lost its glass factory. And until like the early 80s, the managers would live in the town. They would subsidize the local arts committee. They would go to the balls. They would all live together in the same place. And starting in the 80s, those guys moved to New York to work for companies which were part of subsidiaries. Private equity came in. And you really lost that communal aspect. And I spent a lot of time in so-called Trump country. I made a movie about a town in West Virginia. And people talk a lot about the politics, but that real grief, I don't think is properly acknowledged, that there's a real suffering of that loss of community. And the union, I think, can help to create more of that sense of solidarity.
Is that happening though? I mean, just from what you're seeing, is there solidarity or growing solidarity among the workers?
I think so. I think there's a huge education effort. I mean, so the way it works is that a bigger union comes into a place like this and does the work of organizing. So there's like 10 big unions. There's one in Pittsburgh, the United Steelworkers Union, which represents 1 million workers. And it's not just steel workers. It's like hospital workers and people work in shoe factories, all kinds of stuff. So the bigger union comes in and offers the structure and organizes the votes. In this case, it's the RWSU, which represents everybody from grave diggers to people at Macy's and all. It's a pretty wide variety. So they offer that structure, and in that, in their work, they're educating people about what it means to belong to a union. And in West Virginia, for example, there still is this very strong sympathy towards the union, even as the state has drifted rightward and has embraced Donald Trump and that kind of politics, there's still this lingering, warmth and attachment and loyalty towards the idea of union, which kind of transcends politics. And so you've seen, Marco Rubio, who's a conservative Republican, has endorsed the Amazon effort, and is Catholic, I believe, too, by the way. And so, yes, I think that there's sort of seeds of something there, but it's so hard in America, I think, to get away from, to sort of shine the light on what's actually happening. Like, we're so enamored with this idea of hyper efficiency and this great company and the kind of glamour and the narrative of like this is a great place to work and there's upward mobility and you can get promoted and all this stuff. But when you look at the truth of what's actually happening, and it's this huge warehouse where people don't really know each other, and where so one breaking method too is to make sure that workers don't spend too much time together. So they rescheduled the bus routes. I don't know if you saw this, to avoid too many workers being in the same place and being able to talk to each other. And so that is obviously not human, and takes away from that the human dignity and the relationships that obviously, I mean, Catholic social teaching, but also simple human decency promote.
Christine, you wanted to add something. Sorry.
I was just going to jump in. Yeah, there's a lot of rich points there. What John is describing in these places around the United States, including Alabama and West Virginia, I believe, is really on target. And it reflects something of the truth. Catholic social teaching is trying to give what it believes is a realistic, truthful way of looking at being human and looking at work. It's not intended to be some sort of heavenly, different, Gnostic view that comes down and says, oh, you never knew this, but this is what work is about. It's actually just the opposite. It's saying, here's a lens that we think actually explains better than this neoliberal lens or individualist lens, what it really means to be human. And when you hear these stories, which I too find in my research and in experience, this grief of a loss of the organic bonds of community in so many places in our country, including in the union culture, this reflects and this confirms, I think, the point that you read in Catholic social thought and also in union movements, which is we are interconnected and we do better when we're in community. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it can be. We're finite. We're sinners. That's going to be true no matter what. But at the same time, people thrive. I mean, look at the pandemic. What have people pined away for? Being together, being in community, being connected. And so this is so crucial to human survival, but also human flourishing. John, I didn't realize that that element, that dimension of the bus routes. I think that's so fascinating. One other point is Catholic thought and union movements are both keen on what we might call economic rights. We talk about political rights, but we tend to think of rights as individual. But when you start to speak about economic rights, like the right to form unions, the right to living wages, and so forth, those have a communal element to them. And they involve more than simply letting people alone. They involve making sure that at the end of the day, all those workers can support their families, for example, when they all go home. And that is a different, broader and deeper and more positive way of looking at rights than we tend to want to acknowledge, again, in our larger, especially our economic culture right now. One last thing I want to say, I know these are disparate, and this has to do with race. Studies of working class people, both in Europe and the United States, consistently find, particularly in the United States, that working class people of color have a recognition of and appreciation for unions at higher percentages than do white working class people. They're both supportive, but the numbers are much higher if you look at some of the studies by Michelle Lamont and others. And so I believe this reflects something about Bessemer, that you've got a community of workers who, most of whom are Black, who understand what it means to be powerless in front of larger powers, in front of larger political, cultural, economic powers that be.
John, do you want to add anything to that and what you're seeing again at Amazon and what you've found in your research?
I think the political aspect is very important. That historians I talked to described Joe Biden as being the most pro-union president since FDR. And unions in the 50s had a seat at the table and could shut down parts of the economy and weren't afraid to sometimes. And that has been lost. That in our current, so in the last 50 or 20 or 30 years, for example, the free trade consensus that unlimited free trade was always good, and there might be some minor bad consequences. But overall, as a society, we wanted this unlimited free trade. We wanted the shareholder imperative to maximize profits for shareholders. And there was no political force in Washington that sort of had this political muscle. And I think that's the bigger point is for this vote is that a win would take a step towards making unions again a political force in Washington to push back against what we've seen in the past 50 years.
But John, also that whole tired thing of money makes the world go round, right? I mean, there are economic interests here too. Yes, we're talking about workers' rights, but we're also talking about an economy that needs to keep moving. What do you see in terms of the shifting context around the economy with unions, with Amazon, with workers?
So one thing I learned covering collective bargaining contracts for the Wall Street Journal is that when times are good, workers have a lot of leverage. And the reason that unions got such great contracts in the 50s was not because U.S. Steel suddenly had a Good Samaritan complex. It was because they were making a lot of money and they had to keep making money to keep they had opportunity to keep making money. And there was a post-war boom, and we were building the suburbs and the interstate highways, and that required all this steel, and there was huge opportunity for profits. And so that meant it made sense to give the unions good contracts to keep them going. I covered this contract a few years ago. It was Alcoa, which is a company that makes aluminum, had just gotten a huge contract to make aluminum siding for the Ford F-150. Ford had said they were going to make their cars out of aluminum, and so they needed all this aluminum. And there was a bargaining session going on, and USW, the United Steelworkers, got this incredible contract with like a 20% raise, and I forget exactly what it was, but it was like a really good contract. And I was really stunned. It was like in 2014, this industrial union is winning this labor fight. Like I thought the days of strong, good contracts were over. And it was explained to me that no, they had won because Alcoa needed them badly to make this aluminum to sell to Ford, which was making all these cars. And that's where we are now with the Amazon workers, that they are essential in the economic context. Amazon needs them. And Amazon is making crazy profits right now, billions and billions of dollars extra last year and during the pandemic. It's a company worth
70 billion, I think.
70 billion. It's a company worth $1.5 trillion. And so I think, and Christine knows more about this than me, but I think Catholic social teaching would also uphold economic freedom, and that there's this realistic point of view that we have invented automation, we've invented these technologies, the internet's not going away. Jeff Bezos figured out a way of selling us everything we need. And I think it would be against Catholic social teaching to say we're going to shut that down and go back to making shoes in our hometown. So there's a balance there, I think. And again, I don't think the unions are saying Amazon needs to go away. I think they're saying workers deserve a bigger piece of the pie.
I would agree with that. And there are strains, like as in any tradition, there are strains of let's go back to making shoes, but that in our own town. However, that's a hearkening back to sort of this, and you saw this in the early part of the 20th century among some groups of Catholics, sort of a hearkening back to the medieval guilds, where we all knew who made our shoes and so forth. And I think there's a big kernel of truth in that, in that everybody lives their economic lives on the ground eventually, right? So no matter, when I get the box from Amazon, somewhere, somehow, maybe in Bessemer, Alabama, there's a person who put that in the box, who goes home to their family. And the embodied nature of the economy, no matter how high-tech, financialized, or, abstract, globalized the economy is, always needs to be attended to. And this is one of the strengths, I think, of the Catholic social way of thinking about this. again, not only Catholics, but this is one contribution that this approach gives, that we are embodied beings. We are only economic, and we only work because we have bodies. And those embodied realities of work always need to be honored and attended to, which takes us back to even things like bathroom breaks on the warehouse floor, right? And so that needs to anchor. However, we then approach the incredible productivity and all the opportunities of this globalized high-tech economy that we're in. And so balancing those out, I agree with you, John. It isn't just a matter of saying, let's only go local, and big companies and everything about them are wrong. But the problem is that the power tends to balance on the other side too much. And this goes back to why unions, particularly in on the ground unions in local situations, or collective organizing, is always going to be necessary. Another question that's interesting too is, like, why doesn't Amazon want the union? Like, why do big companies that are making all this money fear, why are they so averse to the union? And as someone from a working class background myself, to me that always rings a bell. It's like, well, if you don't want me to do this, like, there must be something about it that's going to be really good for my group, and maybe not so good for your group, And so I think that's also a very interesting point to unravel.
I think it's also
John?
important to say that unions create a political force that is not perfect, that makes mistakes, that is vulnerable to corruption and all the things that companies and governments and churches are also vulnerable to. And so over time, that is a pain for the company to deal with. And the union can do a lot of good. It can also make mistakes. And so the company obviously sees that vulnerability and imperfection and says, no, thank you. Like, we'll handle this on our own. And it's important to say that unions are flawed, but can also do tremendous good and have an important role to play in representing workers.
And we participate in this corruption, right? I mean, those of us who want Amazon to deliver within hours, I place an order here in New York, and sometimes it arrives the same day, and it's coming from outside of the state. So I'm just thinking, in terms of our social structures of sin, and our personal participation in that sin, Christine, there's something there also in Catholic teaching.
Oh, for sure. We're in a mass consumer economy, which has so many benefits. But at the same time, and intuitively, I'm sure you're not the only person who thinks this, isn't it kind of weird? Isn't there something a little off about getting these packages so quickly? What's behind the curtain, right? And our own participation in consumerism, if we want to use that as a more negative term, we all are consumers. We're inevitably consumers. Has to do from the point of Catholic social thought, and Francis and John Paul II have spoken a lot about this, with the fact that we value having over being. We value getting over sort of cherishing what we have, and we're taught to always want the next new, shiny, better thing. But it's built into our economy. How long will the computers we're using even, be usable, at least as we tend to think of it, without needing an update and so forth. So there should be, from the point of view of a Catholic social perspective, a real critical, reflective approach that someone who calls themselves Catholic or Christian or even human has toward this sort of easy everything for me without any, don't look behind the curtain, which I think consumerism really teaches us to do. Don't even ask where that piece of chicken came from. Like, have it all packaged in plastic, and I don't want to know about the poultry workers. John, I was interested to see that the poultry workers in Alabama have been unionized prior to this push, and that union has been involved with what's going on at the Amazon plant, and those, of course, are almost all people of color as well, poor working class people of color. But this idea that those are the hidden people that we don't need to pay attention to, that's part of social sin from the point of view of Catholic thought, and it ought to be something that a thoughtful person is paying attention to and examining their conscience on, even.
Yeah, so I mean, what's the sacrifice? What needs to give on our part?
Right. Catholics should be for higher prices. Even though there's a limit to that as well, right? Higher prices mean some of the working class folks who are working at the factory may not be able to afford as much. So how do you balance? You use the word balance, John. I think it's right. How do you balance the sacrifice that might be asked for, especially for those who are more well off, versus the floor, or at least the maximal, or the ample sufficiency that Catholic social thought would argue is due everybody who works, every working family. But we've lost a sense of sufficiency in a consumerist culture, and that goes across the board. We don't know what enough is. We don't know what too much is. And this affects working class people as well as more affluent people. And that creates quite a miasma when you try to figure out the moral path here, right? Or the Christian path.
I think, Christine, you pointed out too, there's something to be said, and the church has a role in doing this, and everybody who is involved in philosophical thinking in terms of what we want and need. And I meet people in the Rust Belt who have salaries of say, $30,000 a year, and are pretty happy and have figured out a way to not want a McMansion and two cars, which in America now, if you look at like the American dream in the 50s compared to today, we've upgraded it and we've made it bigger, and your life is complete if you go to a big city and have a great career and make all this money. And that's not the only path to happiness, or if it is at all. So I think in reminding people that you can live in a small town. I interviewed a guy this morning who teaches middle school in Moundsville for my Moundsville blog, and he's really happy teaching 8th graders to read in this tiny town in West Virginia, and I guarantee he doesn't make very much money.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Talking about, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that's a great example of economic flourishing from a Catholic social perspective. On the ground, in reality, in Moundsville, right? That economic and personal livelihood and communal livelihood is again embodied on the ground, and it happens in homes, it happens in schools, it happens all over the place. And versus what Lawrence Glickman, the labor historian, talks about in his one of his books, the American standard of living, quote unquote, that the American standard of living became the measure by which unions, as well as the wider public, started to think of what success or what enough meant. But the problem with this American standard of living, going back to the early 20th century, is it is a consumer-based measure that always goes up. It always goes up. How do I know? How does my faculty know that they're doing well? Does their money go up every year? Now, the cost of living goes up too, right? But it's all based on consumerism, right? I buy my living, cost of living, and therefore I need more money, and so it's an endless loop that goes against the family that you just described, the families you just described, John. They're actually living a countercultural life based on the larger ethos that we're saturated with right now. But they also have a wisdom that we who are not so constrained have lost and need to learn from.
We could continue this conversation, and I really wish we could. But I want to end by reading something that Pope Francis said in 2020 on St. Joseph's Day, and then I'm going to ask you each to sum up what you get from this, but also in light of Amazon, in light of workers' rights and the dignity of the human person. Here's what he says. Every injustice inflicted upon a person who works means trampling upon human dignity, even the dignity of the person who carries out the injustice. On the other hand, the vocation God gives us is much higher, to create and recreate work. But this can be done only when the conditions are just and human dignity is respected. John, Christine, over to you.
I would start as a journalist with demanding transparency for ourselves, for work conditions, so that we hold this up to the light. Because we tell stories like, monitoring your bathroom breaks. We all know that's not acceptable, but it's been happening for years at Amazon. So as a society, I think there is a way in which we can really embrace that and act on it little by little, but make it basically not okay. I'm going to tell you a story which was related to me by a friend in Wheeling, West Virginia. It's about a guy who had a shop where he sold hunting rifles, and he got wiped out by Walmart. So here's this big box store coming in, little guy's store gets destroyed. What he decided to do was to buy his hunting rifles from Walmart and then offer people trips to go and show them the beautiful land and take them hunting. I mean, you might not agree with hunting, but here's a guy embracing something more human and accepting the realism that he could no longer have his own shop, that something else had come in, had crushed his economic way of life, and developing a human way that depended on relationships and that acknowledged that he had to buy his hunting rifles from Walmart. I know that's an odd example, but I thought of that.
I want to affirm the work of the journalists, John included, in holding the realities of working people's lives up to the light, particularly those lives that tend to be hidden and not in the limelight. And this is where the Amazon workers are a great example of exactly that point. It's poignant that the Pope speaks this on the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker, who in tradition was also a very hidden person in the Gospels, who is known as a worker, as a carpenter, and so forth, but we don't see him working. He's there, he's essential, and at the same time, he's invisible. And this is very much what you see in the example of the Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, on so many levels, marginalized in the United States in our history in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of the type of work, but doing essential work, which John also pointed out. And this is something that the Catholic tradition and Pope Francis really appreciate, that there are all these people who do all this essential work, and they deserve a dignified regard from society, as well as dignified access to what John A. Ryan would have said in his day, sufficiency, security, and status through their work. And underlying all that is dignity, but also the ability to have what you need to have enough to flourish in a human way, as John's story also reflects.
Christine, John, thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for helping us in the formation of our own consciences. And hopefully we'll be a little more conscious when we press click and buy on Amazon.com and others. And not only that, but whenever we do make purchasing decisions, to think about those workers on the other side that are preparing the goods to arrive at our door. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on Behind the Story today. For more videos like this, subscribe to America's YouTube channel. You can also follow our coverage and deeper analysis of the Amazon union story, trade unions, and the dignity and rights of workers on our website, americamagazine.org.